says, "Behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was just and devout, and he was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him." So you have this guy, old guy. We're not given his age, but I believe he's an older gentleman. Now, I want to stop right here to address, as you know, I love to address the contradictions. People like to accuse the Bible of contradictions, and so I want to make sure we lay that out so that there's no mystery or confusion there. Because here it says that the Holy Spirit was upon him. Well, now wait a minute. If you go fast forward into the gospel, at the end of the gospel stories or at the beginning of Acts, Jesus is telling the disciples, hey, I have to go away. I know you want me to stay, but it's a good thing that I leave, because if I don't leave, I cannot send the Holy Spirit. And people say, aha, contradiction. Because Jesus says the Holy Spirit can't come unless he leaves. Well, here he is, but there's the Holy Spirit. So what's going on? How is the Holy Spirit being upon people if Jesus hasn't left to send the Holy Spirit? And they say there's a contradiction. You see the same thing going on. John the Baptist, filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb. We see that the Holy Spirit comes upon John the Baptist's father, and he prophesies. Right? We see that Elizabeth also filled with the Holy Spirit at one point. And so what is going on here with seemingly there's people with the Holy Spirit, but Jesus says Holy Spirit can't come till later. So what's going on? Well, we actually see a difference of what the Holy Spirit is doing. The Holy Spirit is active all through the Old Testament and given credit for what he is doing. There's many roles that the Holy Spirit fulfills. Right, that he regenerates our hearts so that we now love the things of the Lord rather than loving our sin. He restrains our sin, right, in times whenever we would probably do a lot worse than we end up doing. That was the restraining hand of the Holy Spirit on us. We see that he empowers us, right, for service, the gifts of the Holy Spirit that he gives to us. There's all sorts of roles. We see that he at times provides revelation. Right? The prophets in the Old Testament received their revelation from the Lord through the Holy Spirit. However, the biggest difference, the thing that makes the defining difference between pre-Christ Holy Spirit activity and after Christ Holy Spirit activity is the permanence of it. See, in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit didn't fill a person. They were then their spirit filled. See, in the New Testament, we're told that, don't you know your body is a temple of God? Don't you know that you are a temple of the Holy Spirit? The New Testament teaches that we are indwelled, that we have the Holy Spirit in us. In the Old Testament, pointing forward to the New Covenant, I believe it's in Jeremiah where it talks about how God will send his Spirit to be with mankind. And so there's this lasting presence of the Holy Spirit. That's what Jesus was talking about. In the Old Testament, you would have where the Holy Spirit, as the Old Testament calls it, would come upon someone. As it says here with Simeon, that the Holy Spirit came upon him. And so you don't actually have a contradiction, because in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit would come upon someone at a time for a purpose and not stay. You have the Holy Spirit coming upon even people who were not godly people. Saul, right? The Holy Spirit came upon Saul to serve a particular purpose. But he was a man who did not honor God. You have the same with David. The judges, throughout the book of the Judges, there are times they're empowered by the Holy Spirit for leadership, for encouragement, to lead the armies of God against his enemies. And the Holy Spirit comes, is upon them, fulfills its purpose, and departs. And so whenever Jesus says the Holy Spirit will come later, he's talking about that permanent indwelling of God's presence living in and among believers. That's not what we saw in the Old Testament. And so whenever it says that Simeon, the Holy Spirit came upon him, that's not contradicting Jesus.